Hey, this is Jono. Now, are you involved in an open source project or community? Well, you're definitely going to want to avoid these 5 mistakes. Let's go. All right, welcome, my friend. I hope you're safe and well wherever you may be. Now, open source has had a huge impact on the world. It's disrupted so many different industries and technologies. And yes, I appreciate the fact that I just used the word disrupted. I'm sorry, I hope you forgive me, and the next time I see you, you can kick me in the balls. Here's the thing though, I've worked with hundreds of different open source companies, and these 5 mistakes keep cropping up over and over again. So I thought, why don't I put together a video, walk through them, so we can hopefully banish the world of them. Now, I've got some trusty notes here, and I do appreciate and acknowledge there is an irony of me talking about open source while looking at an iPad. And some of you will be enraged about this in the comments, but let me be very clear about this. I don't care. All right, so our first mistake that we want to avoid is not picking a license. Now, the way I look at it is a good open source project really provides 4 fundamental pieces. The first one is that it provides technology that you can download and use and get a lot of value out. Okay, it's got to have a practical, tactical impact on the world. The second benefit is that the software comes with an agreed set of terms and conditions about how you can use the code and how you can use the software in a way that's going to be equitable for everybody. The third benefit is that the project provides an environment where people can be collaborative and build great technology and evolve and grow the project. And then the fourth benefit is that that environment is safe, it's equitable, and it enables that everybody can be as successful as possible. Now, a license is critical for that second piece, which is an agreed set of terms and conditions in how you can use that code and how you can use that software. Now, I don't want to get too deep into what that license should be today, because that's a giant subject. It always involves a massive bun fight whenever anyone talks about this. But I do want to summarize a couple of thoughts on this and then share the most critical piece is just to pick a license and put it into your GitHub or GitLab repo. Now, there are broadly 2 types of license in the world, copyleft and permissive. Now, a copyleft license basically means that when you've got that code base and somebody goes and makes a change to it and an improvement to it, the license will determine how that change, how that improvement gets shared with the rest of the community, okay? Now, an example of a copyleft license is the GNU public license that was forged by GNU and Richard Stallman and that whole crew. And it was hugely popular, especially in the earlier days of open source and free software. And Linux, for example, the Linux kernel uses the GPL. Now, what I love about the GPL is that when somebody makes a series of changes, they create a patch set or they create a pull request, that those changes need to be applied under the same conditions as the original license. What this essentially creates is a level of virality where a piece of software will always grow and always improve and will always fundamentally be freely available to everybody. The challenge with a copyleft license is that many companies, many businesses have struggled to be able to figure out a business model that's going to work well with it. And this is one of the reasons why permissive licenses have become increasingly popular in recent years. And examples of this are the MIT license, the Apache license, the BSD license. These are all permissive licenses, and they essentially have a slightly more limited but very specific set of terms and conditions in what you can do with the software. Now, as I said, I don't want to get into the religious battle about whether you go copyleft or permissive. That is an exercise for you wonderful people. The key thing is pick a license and make sure that it's very, very clear in the repo where your code exists. Now, the second mistake that I often see in open source projects is a lack of onboarding. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. Imagine you've got a brand new open source project, right? And you've got a code base that's working, it does something useful, and you start going out trying to find other developers who can kind of come in and help, okay? So they come into the project and they start using it and they think, oh, there's a feature that I'd like to build, or there's a bug that I'd like to fix. Or alternatively, imagine you've got a more popular open source project that lots of people are using. People are talking about it on social media, on Hacker News, at conferences, and people come into the project and they're eager to contribute code to it. Now, however these folks arrive at your repo, whether on GitHub or GitLab or wherever else, they need to be able to figure out how to convert what they're seeing in their head as a feature or a bug fix into an actual piece of code that they can submit for review. Now, how they go from idea to implementation is what onboarding is all about, and we can basically divide it into 2 key files. One is readme.md and one is contributing.md. I like to think of the readme.md file as where you talk about what the project is, why it's useful, how they can get started with it, and where they can go to learn more. It's in this file where you should talk about how they can literally download the software and put it on their computer, on their device, on their cloud, or how they download the code and how they build it and get it up and running from the perspective of a user of that code base. It's also in your readme.md file where you should talk about the project itself, the goals of the project, where people can stay up to date, where they can communicate with developers, the culture and the conduct expectations of that project too. I tend to think of a readme.md file as essentially a one-page summary of everything that's critical for somebody to know who's brand new to using your code and joining your project. Now, your contributing.md file is critical for people who want to contribute to the project, okay? So think of it as a readme.md, but it's designed for people who are interested in actually contributing code or documentation or translations or tests or something else into the project. Now, there are three key categories of information that you want to include in your contributing.md. The first is technical considerations. How do you get the code? How do you build it? What are things that people should know in how they build that code and avoiding common errors and problems as they do so? Now, the goal here is to get someone up and running as quickly as possible. If you have 35 steps that somebody has to go through to build your project, they're just not going to do it. People don't have that much patience. So try to think about what's the quickest, most efficient way in which somebody can get that code onto their computer, their device, their cloud as quickly and as easily as possible, and break it down into a simple set of steps. Now, the second area that you want to cover in your contributing.md file is how do they actually make a contribution? So how do they submit, for example, a pull request into your project? And what are the expectations that they should have around doing so? So for example, with many open source projects, if somebody submits a pull request, they're expected to also make sure that they run a series of tests. Or if they're creating a brand new class or a function, they create a new set of tests to cover that. Now, sadly, a lot of open source projects don't really write this stuff down. They expect people to use the magic of mind reading to figure out these expectations that go into a pull request. Now, if you're not clear about this, the risk that you run is that somebody submits a pull request, they didn't include half the stuff that you were expecting. Therefore, you have to reject the pull request or ask for more details, and then they get frustrated. And this brand new relationship is on a bit of a wobbly footing because those expectations were not set clearly. Now, a little bit later in this video, I'm going to talk about the importance of code review and having a code review workflow. You definitely want to make sure that that code review workflow is very clearly stated in your contributing.md. Now, the third area that you should include in your contributing.md file, pins and needles in the old leg. You know, that doesn't feel good, and it doesn't feel good when you're in your early 40s and becoming a very old man. Oof. Now, the third area that you want to cover in your contributing.md file is the community expectations and norms, right? So most communities will have expectations around conduct, like such as reading and understanding a code of conduct. Or there may be communication channels that people should go to. Or there may be other terms and guidelines that you expect your community members and contributors to understand, okay? So make sure, again, that they're visibly listed and clear in that file. Visibly listed doesn't make any sense, but you get what I'm talking about. Now, this seems like a good opportunity as I climb down and let the blood hopefully actually circulate in my leg. It seems like a good opportunity to invite you to like and subscribe to my channel. So like this video because that helps my videos get placement and people to actually look at them. And also subscribe and hit that lovely notification bell and that will keep you updated with all the new things that I'm waffling on about on my channel. All right, so the third mistake that a lot of people make when it comes to open source projects is an unclear code review process. Now, when you think about how code is contributed into an open source project, the fundamental unit of participation is a pull request, okay? It is the place where you will take some code that you've written, you will submit it into the project for review. Usually some developers will take a look at it, they'll evaluate it, they will provide comments or feedback where things need to be fixed or improved, and then when it's in a decent quality state, it then gets accepted and merged into the main branch. Now, unfortunately, there's been many projects that I've seen over the years, especially when they're kind of getting started and up and running, that don't have a particularly clear code review process. It's just kind of done on a back of the napkin, we'll figure it out as we go along kind of capacity. And that's fine when it's you and maybe one or two other people, but if you want to start having more developers coming in and contributing to your project, having a very clear, if simple, way of managing your code review process is absolutely essential. Now, I'm a big believer in keeping things simple, okay? So the key thing here is choose a process, talk it through with whoever else you're working with in your project, and just write it down, okay? Now, if you don't have a formalized code review workflow, it's totally fine, but the key thing I would recommend is just start simple, right? Just have a really dead simple way of reviewing code, write it down into a page that people will be able to reference. It could go into your contributing.md, for example, or it could be linked from that particular file. Start there and then iterate from there. All right, so let me give you an example of a simple code review workflow that you could start with if you don't already have one. So we're going to assume that a developer has gone and got your code, they've created their fix or feature, and now they're ready to submit it. Now, what I'd recommend is that you first of all create a pull request template. This is essentially some text that's pre-populated into a brand new pull request when someone starts one that asks a series of questions that the developer will fill in, okay? So brand new pull request is created, the template appears, and then they go and respond to the requests inside of the template. Now, this is a good way to solicit additional information from the developer to provide some context around the pull request. And also, by the way, issue templates are super helpful as well. So now the developer goes and submits their pull request, and you put details in your contributing.md about how to do so. And now, let's say the next part of the process is that one or two developers in the existing development team will go and review that pull request and provide feedback and input. If it doesn't work, they'll outline where the submission doesn't work, if there's things that aren't right there, if there's things that are missing, if there's inefficiencies in there, if it's breaking certain coding conventions and rules that you've put in place. That feedback will be provided, and it will be provided inside of the pull request, not on Slack, not in a forum, not on a mailing list, inside of the pull request itself. Now, typically what will happen at this point is there'll be a bit of back and forth between the person who submitted the pull request and the team that's reviewing it, and then eventually the pull request will be hammered into shape where it's ready to be integrated into the main branch. Now, what I would recommend is that you then say, okay, we want at least two developers, 2 + 1, to essentially approve that pull request. When 2 developers +1 it, then we're good to go, and then it can go to the next stage of the process, which will be getting merged into the main branch. Now, of course, you can weave in all kinds of testing and CI/CD, all of those different pieces where necessary, but I just start out with something simple like that. Submit your pull request, it gets reviewed by developers, bounces backwards and forwards, 2 developers +1 it to approve it, boom, goes into the main branch. The key thing is have a plan and write it down. And don't just write it down, but communicate it out to people who are brand new to your project. If somebody is interested in contributing to the code base, make sure that they know this up front so they've got their expectations very, very clear. All right, now the fourth mistake that a lot of open source projects make is a slow time to first response. Now, let me paint the picture of what this is. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that a developer has created a new feature that they want to submit into your code base. So what they do is they go through what we've just talked about. They go and create a pull request, they fill in the pull request template, they submit it, and it's a really great piece of code. It's well written, it follows the coding standards and conventions that you've documented, all of the things that we've talked about. And then what happens is there's no response. Crickets for 1 day, for 2 days, for 3 days, for 4 days. They keep coming and checking to see if there's been an update, and their pull request is just unilaterally ignored. And then they go and look at some of the other pull requests to see how quickly those people had responses, and it's the same situation. 3, 4, 5, 6 days before they get a response. Now, this can be infuriating because they've taken the time to create this contribution for the project, and it feels like it's just being ignored. Now, what I'd recommend you do is you set a goal for the maximum time to first response. So in other words, when somebody goes and submits a pull request, what is the maximum amount of time they should be expected to wait before they get a acknowledgement and affirmation that a developer has recognized the pull request and is going to look into it? Now, I think a good goal for time to first response is that no more than 48 hours should pass before the submitter of a pull request gets some kind of response. Now, to be very, very clear, I'm not saying that that response should be a complete acknowledgement, review, and merging of the code. that first response may be just someone saying, hey, thank you so much for submitting your pull request. We'll get to it in the next couple of days. The key is that we want to make sure that some kind of response is made to the developer, some kind of acknowledgement. Otherwise, the developer is going to potentially assume that no one particularly cares, no one's really paying attention. Now, you may be thinking, okay, that sounds reasonable, Jono, but how long should we set as the goal for a pull request to be reviewed and fully merged in? Well, it's very, very difficult to come up with a target goal for that because one pull request may be fixing a single string in a project, and another pull request may be reviewing a massive chunk of code or a very invasive change to a project that needs a huge amount of testing. So this is the reason why I would recommend focus on time to first response, because then you're acknowledging that first contribution, and then generally just have a good, active, timely code review process to make sure that things are moving along at a reasonable clip. Now you may be wondering, okay, Jono, how do I measure this? How do I keep track of that? I'm not going to mention specific tools in this video because that's going to age the video, because tools are changing all the time, and there'll be brand new tools that will come out after I've recorded this. You can do your own homework in finding out which tools are available, but there are a number of tools that you can use to measure this. And then the fifth and final mistake that I want to cover in this video is shitty or non-existent documentation. Now, let's be honest, most developers don't really like writing documentation. And I'm sure some of you are going to say, well, but Jono, that stereotype is an old, antiquated view of the world, and many developers like writing documentation. And there is no doubt that there are many wonderful developers who take a responsibility and a keenness to create adequate documentation for the software that they produce. But still, as a general rule, I find that most developers are much more interested and motivated and incentivized in writing code and not necessarily writing words. Unfortunately, documentation is a necessary part of growing any open source project, and there are really three different types of documentation that most projects are going to want to have. Now, the first type of documentation is user-facing documentation. This is the documentation that explains how to use the software that you're producing. Now, this could be how to use a consumer bit of open source software, or, for example, if you're building a developer platform, infrastructure tooling, something along those lines, how to take that software, deploy it, integrate it with other tools, all of those pieces. But documentation that is designed to take the software that's been written and actually make it work in the context that it is intended. Now, the second type of documentation is developer-facing API documentation. So this could be, for example, if you're building a JavaScript framework or a JavaScript platform, is API documentation for the interfaces that you're exposing for JavaScript developers to use in using your framework. Or another type of API documentation here is going to be the internal API for the project itself that's really intended for developers who are contributing fixes and features to the main project. And then the third type of documentation is engineering workflow. It's kind of the things we've already talked through so far in this video, which is how do you submit bugs and issues? How do you submit a pull request, and how does the code review process work? What are your coding conventions and standards? What are the requirements when it comes to copyright and licensing? All of those different elements. Now, for the API documentation, the good news is that most of that can be generally generated. Usually what will happen is people will leave comments in line in the code, and then those comments and the actual structure of the code will be converted into developer-facing API documentation. But for the other two types of documentation, user-facing documentation and engineering workflow, that generally has to be written by human beings. Now, the good news here is that for the engineering-centric documentation, usually there isn't a lot to write, okay? You can usually summarize this in a couple of markdown files or some pages on a wiki or even some pages on a blog, okay? Just get the core principles of how the collaboration works in the open source project and you're good to go. The real challenge comes with the user-facing documentation, because the more your software grows and adds more features and capabilities, then the more documentation is going to be needed, and people are going to be using your software in many, many different situations and contexts. I think the key thing I want to get over today, and the key change in our attitudes towards documentation, is that no one really reads long-form documentation anymore. You know, years ago when I got started in open source in the late 90s, we had manuals, right? You go and read a manual. It would be the Linux documentation project, or someone would write a book, but you'd read like long-form tutorial pages, and then common questions would be collected together into frequently asked questions lists, and you'd go to the frequently asked questions index and look for your question, and then try to find the right answer to that question and apply that into your particular problem. People just don't do that anymore. If we've got a question, if we can't figure out how to do something, we all tend to do the same thing. We go to Google and we type it into Google. And ideally, our solution will appear on the front page of Google. So what I would recommend you do is, instead of creating manuals and books of information about your software, is just create lots and lots of short, focused, specific bits of documentation that solve specific problems. This can be a collection of blog posts, a collection of articles, it could be a collection of gists, whatever it might be. Just focus on one specific problem and how you can provide a solution to that particular problem. Now, part of the reason why I recommend this is that, first of all, you can crank out more documentation because you're not trying to build this big monolithic book or chunk of material, but it also means that lots of these smaller, focused articles are easier to write. They're less mentally consuming than writing a whole book, for example. And it also means that when you do the right level of search engine optimization, that more of these individual bits of content will manifest on Google. That means more users will see it, and you'll get more people solving their problems. Alrighty, that is it. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please hit that like button because it really does help make sure that my videos get a little bit more prominence when people are searching for things that relate to building communities and open source and movements and all that kind of stuff. And if you found this video useful and you want to see more of them, hit that subscribe button and, of course, tap that cheeky little notification bell and you'll be informed of future videos that are coming out from me. All right, stay safe, stay well, peace out.